Arthur Lucas, hanged December 11th, 1962. On Tuesday, December 11th, 1962, Arthur Lucas, an African-American from Detroit, Michigan, was hanged at midnight in Toronto's Don Jail for the November 17th, 1961 gangster murder of Turpin Lucas, Detroit pimp and witness in an upcoming narcotics trial. Murdered at the same time at the Kendall Avenue rooming house in Toronto's Annex neighborhood was Carolyn Ann Newman, a 20-year-old prostitute. Both Crater and Newman had their throats cut, with Crater also being shot 4 times. Newman, Crater, and Lucas, a 54-year-old panderer, were all African American and members of the Detroit underworld, Lucas having been sent to silence Crater. Hanged at the same time as Lucas was Ronald Turpin, a 29-year-old cop killer who died for the murder of Metropolitan Toronto Police Constable Frederick John Nash. Lucas, a man of limited intelligence, was convicted on purely circumstantial evidence, as no witness could place him at the scene of the double homicide. He went to his death proclaiming his innocence. Lucas was tried only for the murder of Turpin Lucas. Amazingly, Robert J. Hashosky, in his book The Last to Die, Ronald Turpin, Arthur Lucas, and the End of Capital Punishment in Canada, references a 1967 news program, W5, which tracked down 4 members of the jury that convicted Lucas, and 3 of the 4 expressed doubts as to his guilt. What the actual hell? Then why did they convict him? For a more detailed discussion of Lucas's trial and potential innocence, I highly recommend Hashosky's The Last to Die, which should be easily obtainable for listeners in Canada. Both Arthur Lucas and Ronald Turpin were pronounced dead at 12:18 a.m., but among the revelations found in The Last to Die was the bungling of Lucas's execution, his head being practically ripped from his body. After an early morning inquest, both of the condemned men were buried in unmarked graves in Toronto's Prospect Cemetery. As an aside, I spent the summer of 1980 living in an annex rooming house 1 block east of the Kendall Avenue double murder site. Ronald Turpin, hanged December 11th, 1962. On Tuesday, December the 11th, 1962, Ronald Turpin was hanged at midnight in Toronto's Don Jail for the murder of Metropolitan Toronto Police Constable Frederick John Nash in a shootout on Danforth Avenue during the early morning hours of February the 12th, 1962. Turpin was a 28-year-old career criminal who had a paranoid fear of being beaten or murdered by the police. At his trial, Turpin would claim that Nash fired first and that he had shot back in self-defense. The jury did not believe him. Nash had pulled over Turpin's battered 1954 Pontiac van shortly after the latter, Turpin, had burgled the nearby Red Rooster restaurant for a haul of $600. The constable had recognized the burglar from his appearance on a wanted poster, the charge against Turpin being shoot with intent. Hanged at the same time with Turpin was Arthur Lucas, a Detroit pimp sentenced to death for the gangland murder of Turpin Lucas in Toronto in 1961. Both Turpin and Lucas were pronounced dead at 12:18 a.m. and were buried in unmarked graves in Toronto's Prospect Cemetery. Ronald Turpin has the dubious honor of being the last person sentenced to death in Canada who was actually hanged. The material for today's video comes from two main sources: The Last to Hang by Robert J. Hashosky and The Practice of Execution in Canada by Ken Leighton Brown. Both authors note that the double execution led to considerable public protest, a crowd of anti-hanging picketers gathering outside the Don jail on the night of the fatal event. Louis Fisher, hanged June 27th, 1961. On Tuesday, June the 27th, 1961, Louis William Baldwin Fisher, 25, was hanged at Toronto's Don Jail for the stabbing murder of 36-year-old Margaret Peggy Bennett on June the 10th, 1960. On the fatal evening of June the 9th, Fisher, his wife, and two friends went to the beer parlor at the Wembley Hotel on Toronto's Danforth Avenue. Fisher's wife left shortly thereafter, but he stayed on until closing time, which was just after midnight, having consumed, by his own admission, as many as 25 glasses of beer. After leaving the beverage room, Fisher encountered Peggy Bennett, a woman he knew by sight, who inquired if he had his car. Telling her to wait, he went home and fetched it, returning to the Wembley to pick her up. Bennett suggested they go to a restaurant for coffee, but Fisher demurred, claiming to have no money. But when Bennett wanted a cigarette, he did stop at a restaurant where he could get a pack on credit. As they sat in the car smoking, Fisher said Bennett began to fondle him. He drove off and she continued fondling him. Eventually, Fisher told Bennett, as reported in Fisher's appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada, that, quote, if she wanted to get it, she was going to get it. And so he pulled into a gas station parking lot and stabbed her a minimum of 15 times before pushing her body out of the car. Fisher would later tell the police, quote, I really went off my rocker, I guess, or I must have been drunk, or a combination of both. Perhaps, but the psychiatrist called by the prosecution said Fisher, in spite of all the beer he had consumed, was still able to form the intent to commit murder, and Fisher hanged, leaving a wife and 4 children. His last words on the scaffold were, "The Lord is my shepherd." Fisher was pronounced dead at 12:03 a.m. As an interesting side note, there was a full moon on June the 9th, 1960, and during the early morning hours of June the 10th. My primary sources for today's video is the text of the Supreme Court judgment when Fisher's appeal was denied. The case is also briefly mentioned in The Practice of Execution in Canada by Ken Leighton Brown. I also looked at a document entitled Ontario Cemeteries Act Site Investigation, the Old Don Jail Burial Site. Mickey Feener, hanged July the 13th, 1961. On July the 13th, 1961, Owen Maxwell Feener, 23, who went by the nickname Mickey, was hanged at the Temiskaming District Jail in Haileybury, Ontario, for the beating and stabbing murder of 26-year-old Kathleen K. Chouinard at Timmins, Ontario, on October the 4th, 1960. Feener was born in Nova Scotia and worked as a hard rock miner. He came from a dysfunctional family and had an IQ in the 60s, often being described as retarded. But, in spite of his lack of intelligence, the 6-foot blonde giant had no trouble attracting women. At the time of his arrest in Kirkland Lake, Ontario, he was initially detained on an outstanding reckless driving charge. Feener was driving a red Austin Healey sports car, on the hood of which he had spelled his nickname Mickey in adhesive tape. A red Austin Healey sports car which belonged to a woman named Kathy Essers, who he had murdered near Fredericton, New Brunswick, in September 1960. As Essers' decomposing body had been discovered, he was detained, and when confronted by Timmins police, who were investigating Kay Chouinard's disappearance, he confessed to killing her and led police to her battered body. Taped to the sports car's dash were pictures of 8 young women. One was Kay Chouinard, one was Kathy Essers, and one was of Dolly Woods, a 17-year-old waitress who had disappeared from Kirkland Lake in April 1959. Feener would confess to her murder shortly before his execution. The 5 other young women were never identified. Feener said he murdered Kay Chouinard as she became upset, quite naturally, after he told her of killing Kathy Essers. Feener suffered from epilepsy and had received a serious head wound from an accidental gunshot when he was 8 years old. It has been suggested that he committed his murders when in an epileptic trance. An epileptic trance. But the jury took only 15 minutes to find him guilty, and he became the last of 9 men hanged at the Temiskaming District Jail. Feener's last meal consisted of steak, fries, and ice cream, while his last words on the scaffold were to the effect that Nova Scotia men were not afraid to die. Earlier, he had donated his eyes to an eye bank with the comment, quote, "I hope the poor devil who gets them trains himself to look at something besides skirts during the course of his life." Did Mickey Feener kill more than 3 women? Was he a serial killer? The secret died with him. The primary source for today's video is the section on Feener in The Last Dance, Murder in Canada, by criminologist Neil Boyd. I also read an article by a woman claiming to be Feener's daughter. I've put a link to it and various other sources in the description. Robert Raymond Cook, hanged November the 15th, 1960. At 12:05 a.m. on Tuesday, November the 15th, 1960, Robert Raymond Cook, a.k.a. Bobby, 23, was hanged at the Fort Saskatchewan, Alberta, Provincial Jail for the June 1959 slaughter of his entire family at Stettler, Alberta. His victims included his father, Albert Raymond Cook, aged 52, his stepmother, Daisy May, 37, and his half-siblings, Gerald, 9, Patrick, 8, Christopher, 6, Kathy, 4, and Linda May, 3. Albert Cook had been shot in the chest, while Daisy had most of her head blown off. The children had all been bludgeoned with a shotgun, so violently the gun's wooden stock had splintered into 2 pieces. Cook was a troubled young man who had racked up 19 convictions in the last 7 years, primarily for auto theft and burglary. On Tuesday, June the 23rd, 1959, he was released from the Saskatchewan Penitentiary as part of an amnesty of non-violent offenders in honor of Queen Elizabeth's visit to Canada. After partying with prison friends in Saskatoon, Cook traveled to Edmonton, where on Wednesday, June the 24th, he became enamored with a '59 Chevy Impala convertible. Thursday, June the 25th, Cook was driven out to Stettler by an ex-con and hung around town all day before his father, Albert, picked him up in the family station wagon between 8:30 and 9:15 p.m. It is believed they went to the Cook home, but wherever they went that night, Albert Cook, his wife Daisy, and their 5 children were never seen alive after Robert drove off with his father. In fact, the Cooks were next seen when their decomposing bodies were found buried in the grease pit of their garage. On Friday, June the 26th, Cook appeared at Hood Motors in Edmonton and used his father's identification to trade the family station wagon in for a white Impala convertible with red upholstery, disappearing with the car before all the necessary paperwork was completed. Cook would then embark on an aimless cruise around rural Alberta, eventually arriving back in Stettler on Saturday, June the 27th, when he was stopped by the RCMP over the irregularities involved in his purchase of the Impala. Police went to the Cook home in search of Albert, and on their second visit discovered the bodies in the grease pit. While serving his last sentence in the Saskatchewan Penitentiary, Cook had been attacked by a fellow con, Oliver DeRoche, and was struck in the head 4 times with a lead pipe, resulting in wounds that required some 28 stitches. Given this head injury and the atrocious nature of his crime, Cook was sent to the Ponoka Mental Hospital for psychiatric evaluation. Denied the opportunity to attend his family's funeral, Cook escaped but was recaptured after an 84-hour manhunt. Cook was tried and convicted of murder twice. He was a good-looking and personable young man, so many still refuse to believe that he slaughtered his family for a Chevy convertible. The question of Cook's guilt or innocence is too complicated for this short video, but if listeners are interested in having me examine this issue in detail, please let me know in the comments. A lot has been written about Bobby Cook. My primary resource was The Robert Cook Murder Case, an Alberta story by Frank W. Anderson, whose own case was recently covered on this channel. All other sources are listed in the description. Ernest Cote, hanged March the 11th, 1960. On Friday, March the 11th, 1960, Ernest Cote, 37, was hanged at Montreal's Bordeaux jail for the murder of a Temiskaming bank manager. He was pronounced dead at 12:08 a.m. and has the dubious distinction of being the last man hanged in both Montreal and in the province of Quebec. Cote, a native of North Bay, Ontario, had spent most of his life in prison. He had just finished serving a 15-year sentence for armed robbery when he was arrested for killing bank manager Alexandra Heron, who was shot 3 times during an abortive attempt to rob the Bank of Montreal branch in Temiskaming, Quebec, on May the 15th, 1959. Cote's murder trial was held at Hull, Quebec, and the all-male jury arrived at their guilty verdict in only 15 minutes. Cote's co-accused, Ronald Kyle Alexander Brush, 20, was acquitted of murder as he refused to enter the bank during the course of the holdup. He was, however, sentenced to 3 years for attempted robbery. As an interesting side note, Brush was successfully defended on the murder charge by a female lawyer, Huguette Marie Charette, but once again, the jury was strictly male. The jury that convicted Cote of Heron's murder did not recommend mercy, so when the condemned man learned on Thursday afternoon that his sentence would not be commuted, he appeared to take the news calmly enough. His only comment on learning he would indeed hang was, "I'm sorry it had to be that way." Yet, as the hour of his execution drew near, Cote became agitated and was slightly injured after he threw himself against the wall of his cell. Cote, a Roman Catholic, refused the last rites of the church, a midnight mass, and thus went to his death 30 minutes early. The day after the execution, Cote's mother, who lived in North Bay, released an 8-page typed letter from her son in which he argued against capital punishment. Among his conclusions, quote, "Guilty of murder or not, my execution will in no way deter future bank robbers. As of that, one can be certain." End of quote. My main sources for this account of the execution of Ernest Cote were newspapers accessed via the Google News Archive. The Google News Archive, Google, the best of them being the Regina Leader-Post. Cote is briefly mentioned in Neil Boyd's The Last Dance, Murder in Canada. He rates one whole sentence. Alan Hustack's They Were Hanged, which provides accounts of the last person hanged in each Canadian province, lists a completely different case, that of Henri Hector Legault, as the last Quebec execution. But that dubious honor belongs to Ernest Cote. All of my sources are listed in the description. Marvin Harold McKee, hanged February the 9th, 1960. At 12:09 a.m. on Tuesday, February the 9th, 1960, Marvin Harold McKee, 20, was hanged at the Parry Sound, Ontario jail for the murder of Huntsville, Ontario cab driver Bruce Spears, 22. McKee went to his death quietly and confessed shortly before his execution. McKee had willed his eyes to the eye bank and asked to be buried in the jail yard as a warning to young people to lead better lives. McKee, who was described by the Huntsville Forester newspaper, the Huntsville Forester, as having long sideburns and an Elvis Presley haircut, was pronounced dead at 12:20 a.m. He was the first person under the age of 21 to have been hung since 1953. Not everyone was pleased with McKee's choice of final resting place, complaining that, even in the jail yard, the convicted murderer's body was buried too darn close to the town's main street. The crime for which McKee would hang took place on June the 17th, 1959, at a gravel pit in Dwight, Ontario, near Huntsville, where the condemned man and his accomplice, Wayne Sluman, then 16, had lured Spears and his partner, Francis a.k.a. Fritz Grosso, aged 29. Both men had been shot in the head with a sawed-off .22 rifle, their bodies being found 11 days after the murders. The killers had initially fled the scene, but returned the next day to rob the bodies and found that Spears was still alive. His skull was then crushed, apparently by McKee, to finish him off. The motive for this double murder was robbery, the crime netting a mere $24. The pair kept the stolen taxi and even drove it down to Oshawa, where they picked up a 17-year-old girl, Annie Young, and spent several days hiding out in the bush before Sluman was arrested and McKee and Young were picked up near Elk Lake, Ontario. The trial of both men took place at Bracebridge, Ontario, where on November the 7th, 1959, the all-male jury took only 48 minutes to find McKee guilty, causing him to snarl, "And you call this justice?" His accomplice, Sluman, would plead guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 15 years in the Kingston Penitentiary. Not much has been written about this case, and my primary sources of information have been newspaper reports found via the Google News archive. McKee rates a single reference in The Last Dance, Murder in Canada, where author Neil Boyd describes him as being of, quote, below average mentality, end of quote. End of Marvin Harold McKee. If you enjoyed today's video, please drop a like, comment, and consider subscribing to The Gallows, where we explore Canadian murder cases which ended on the scaffold. And remember, if you're born to hang, you'll never be shot. Cheers. Music used in today's video is The Haunting Aftermath by that patron of the internet, Kevin MacLeod. As for me, I'm fighting a bad head cold, so I apologize in advance for the quality of my narration, but hey, the show must go on.